A dying lynx mother, lost in a freezing storm, collapses inside an old man's cabin. But what happens next? No one could have expected. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was carrying fragile new life inside her. But when she gave birth, one cub was too weak to survive. Could a human help without breaking nature's delicate balance? In the wild, the weakest don't always make it. And time was running out. Many would walk away. But this man made a decision that would change everything. Remember that fading lynx mother? She wasn't done fighting yet. Because sometimes, the most unexpected bonds are the ones that save lives. The mother lynx moved through the blinding snow, her once powerful strides reduced to a slow, staggering crawl. The relentless wind howled around her, tearing through her thin, frost-laced fur. Hunger gnawed at her belly, her ribs pressing sharply against her skin. She had gone too long without food, and the cold was merciless. Her ears twitched against the icy sting, her breath escaping in weak, ragged puffs. She had to keep moving, she had to survive. But her limbs felt heavier with every step, the deep snow dragging at her exhausted body. Then, through the swirling white, a dark shape emerged, wooden walls, a structure standing against the storm. An abandoned cabin. Shelter. She pushed forward, her vision swimming. The moment she stepped inside, the warmth of still air wrapped around her. But it was too late, her legs buckled, her breath hitched, and she crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The storm had passed, leaving a heavy silence over the snow-covered land. Inside the old cabin, the air was still, save for the faintest rise and fall of a weak breath. Isaac Turner, a retired wildlife ranger, pushed open the cabin door, his boots crunching against the frozen floorboards. His sharp eyes swept the room, and then he saw her. A lynx, curled in the corner, barely clinging to life. At first, he thought she was dead. But then, a shallow breath. A weak flicker of her ears. His gaze dropped to her belly, swollen with life. She was pregnant. His jaw tightened. He'd spent years in the wild, knowing when to step back, when to let nature take its course. But this was different. Before he could decide, the lynx let out a low, strangled sound. Her body tensed. A ripple of pain passed through her. She was going into labor. Isaac exhaled sharply. He had seen birth in the wild, violent, raw, unpredictable. The chances of survival, especially in her state, were slim. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, as the lynx let out another labored cry, Isaac made his choice. A strained whimper broke the silence. The mother lynx's body shuddered as the first tiny cub slipped into the world, its damp fur clinging to frail limbs. It let out a weak, pitiful squeak. Instinct drove her, despite her exhaustion. She forced herself to lift her head and lick the newborn, her tongue rasping over its trembling body. Then another came. And another. 3 small, fragile lives, barely moving, their bodies weak from the early birth. The mother tried, licking each one with slow, labored strokes, but her strength was fading fast. Isaac knelt beside her, his heart pounding. He had seen animals born into the bitter wild, where only the strongest survived. He knew better than to interfere. Then, the 4th cub arrived. Small. Too small. It didn't move. No sound. No breath. Isaac's fingers curled into a fist. He shouldn't get involved. But as he looked up, the lynx's weary golden eyes met his. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. Then, with a weak push of her nose, she nudged the lifeless cub toward him. A silent plea. Isaac hesitated only a second before reaching out, his hands closing gently around the fragile, unmoving body. Isaac worked fast. The tiny cub was cold, too cold. He cupped it in his callous hands, gently rubbing its frail body, willing warmth into it. No movement. No sound. He had seen enough dying animals to know when hope was slipping away. Not yet. He grabbed a soft cloth from an old trunk and wrapped the cub tightly before hurrying to the fireplace. The flames crackled, casting flickering light over the room. Isaac adjusted the embers, creating a warm, safe pocket. Carefully, he placed the tiny bundle inside a shoebox lined with fleece, setting it just close enough to the heat. A makeshift incubator. Behind him, the mother lynx stirred. Her breathing was labored, her body weak, but her eyes, those sharp golden eyes, never left him. She watched, silent, her other cubs nestled against her belly. She was too drained to resist him, too spent to move, but there was no mistaking the quiet understanding between them. The minutes stretched, then hours. Isaac stayed awake, shifting between tending the cub and checking on the mother. He fed the fire, kept the warmth steady, rubbed the tiny cub's chest, listening, waiting. The fragile rise and fall of its breath was barely there. Every second counted. Isaac sat back, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but his hands steady with determination. He wasn't sure if the cub would survive the night. But as long as it had a fighting chance, he wasn't giving up. By morning, the mother lynx stirred, her body still weak but her instincts pushing her forward. She lifted her head, nudging her cubs close, her tongue rasping over their tiny forms. Even exhausted, she fought to care for them. Isaac knelt nearby, carefully sliding a shallow dish of warm broth toward her. She sniffed it, hesitant. Then, slowly, she lapped at the liquid, her body desperate for nourishment. He watched, ensuring she had enough to regain her strength. If she failed, her cubs wouldn't stand a chance. The smallest cub still lay in the makeshift incubator, fragile and weak, but its tiny chest now rose and fell with steadier breaths. A flicker of movement, its little paws twitched. Isaac exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. The mother met his gaze again, weary but watchful. No growls. No fear. Just understanding. For now, they were in this fight together. By the third day, the storm had begun to break. The howling wind softened, and pale sunlight peeked through the snow-laden trees. The mother lynx, though still thin and weary, was stronger now. She stretched her stiff limbs, nuzzling each of her cubs. Instinct was calling her back to the wild. Isaac watched as she gathered them, gently lifting each one by the scruff of its neck. But when she turned to leave, she paused. The smallest cub still lay in the shoebox near the fire. She hesitated. Isaac's throat tightened. He had fought to keep the fragile creature alive, but this was not his choice to make. Slowly, he reached into the box, lifting the tiny cub with steady hands. He knelt, placing it in front of her, then stepped back. The lynx lowered her head, sniffing the cub. A long moment passed. Then, with careful precision, she grasped the tiny body in her jaws. Isaac watched in silence as she turned, her cubs following in her snowy footsteps. Then, just before vanishing into the trees, she glanced back once, just once, before slipping into the wilderness. Isaac stood there, the wind biting at his face, knowing he'd likely never see her again. And yet, he had no doubt she would fight for them. The snow had begun to melt, giving way to the first signs of spring. Isaac stood at the edge of the tree-line, his breath steady in the crisp morning air. Then, movement, silent, fleeting. A lynx emerged from the shadows, her golden eyes scanning the land. Behind her, playful figures darted between the trees. One cub lingered, smaller than the rest but nimble, strong. It paused, meeting Isaac's gaze for the briefest moment. A flicker of recognition? Gratitude? He'd never know. Then, just like that, it vanished into the wild. Isaac smiled. Against all odds, they had made it.